to the entertaining Talkin' Sports.
What is going on, football fans? Back at it with another New York Giants video. And in this video, I'm going to kind of recap the entire NFC East. Of course, I did a recap of the New York Giants and their free agency period. I kind of wanted to dive into our rivals, talk about some of the players that have departed, some of the players that they brought in, and probably even more importantly, the cap space going forward for each of these teams, being that the New York Giants, if we're being honest with ourselves, are probably not Super Bowl contenders this year, and we're kind of thinking about the future and how we could set ourselves up to try to dominate this division. So it only makes sense to look at our rivals' future after this free agency period and look at their cap space and some of the players that they may have to make decisions on whether or not they want to retain. All four teams were pretty active, but all four had different approaches. The New York Giants and Washington Redskins had very similar approaches. Well, the Dallas Cowboys seemingly lost a lot of players to try to keep their cap space somewhat in order, and they kept on the most important players on their roster. Well, the Eagles, we all know, are in a bad cap situation, and we'll get into all the specifics throughout this video. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about the Giants, being that I already did an individual video on them. But a quick recap, we know the players they brought in. They brought in a new edge rusher in Fackrell. They brought in a couple special teams pieces as well. Obviously, their big acquisitions were Blake Martinez and James Bradbury, both on 3-year contracts that they'll be able to get out after 2 because they front-loaded the deals. Other than that, in terms of their key departures on last year's roster, well, I'm not going to really count Ogletree as a key departure. He was horrible. Janoris Jenkins we cut late in the season, so the only guy you can really point to, and we'll have to wait and see, it's possible he could still come back if they are able to work out a long-term deal with Leonard Williams, maybe free up a little cap, but I doubt it. The only key departure will more than likely be Marcus Golden. But I wanted to jump into some of the teams and take a look at exactly what they did in this free agency period. And the first team we're going to look at is the Cowboys. And what I'll first do with all the NFC East teams is just talk about the additions and subtractions, and then we'll get into the cap situation for each individual team. So the Dallas Cowboys coming into this offseason, I think the major goal was to keep Dak Prescott and to keep, obviously, Amari Cooper. Cooper being his big play threat. You saw Dak get a lot better after, they brought in Amari Cooper as his weapon a year and a half ago, and that's exactly what they did. But outside of that, they had a lot of key losses. There's no doubt about it. And the really bad news for the Dallas Cowboys was that they were not able to get him on a long-term extension, something that they will try to work on. Of course, Dak came out and said he doesn't plan to play in the franchise tag, so we'll have to wait and see. But I would think it's going to be more than for the $33 million price tag of the franchise tag. But other than that, the Cowboys certainly had some key losses, but they also had some very smart additions and cost-effective, and I'll get right into it. First guy we're going to talk about in terms of a key loss, and it's somebody that you might not have thought of, but Randall Cobb actually, unexpectedly, had a very nice bounce-back season for the Dallas Cowboys last year in their offense. He had 55 catches for 828 yards, filling in for the departed Cole Beasley, who went on and signed with the Buffalo Bills last year. Cobb had a successful year in the slot, and now he signed a lucrative deal of about $9 million a season over 3 years. So there's one player that they're definitely going to have to replace. Of course, they got the young Michael Gallup. They got Cooper back. If I'm a Cowboy fan, I'm not too worried about that. Obviously, you need some help in the slot. They brought Jarwin back, who I also expect to have a more expanded role. Robert Quinn, however, is a pretty substantial loss. Quinn last year, I'm pretty sure, led the team in sacks. He had 11 and a half sacks last year in 14 games. Quinn's a very good player. He's been at a number of stops. Now, he signed on with the Bears, and I honestly don't blame the Cowboys at all for not matching that price tag and thinking about the future. He was a one-year guy, and he performed very well with the Cowboys. That's why he got paid 5 years, $70 million at the age of 30. So I can't really get on the Cowboys for this, but he's certainly going to be missed, being that he did a great job for them at getting after the quarterback. In addition to that, the biggest loss, of course, was Byron Jones, and this was expected. They only had so much money that they could spend, and they prioritized, obviously, Dak Prescott and Amari Cooper. And Byron Jones went on to sign with the Miami Dolphins on a very lucrative 5-year deal. So I expect the Cowboys to try to attack the cornerback position probably in the first round of this year's draft. But you got to think there's going to be some kind of a regression at that position, being that Byron Jones was one of probably the top 10 corners in the league. I don't think you're going to expect a mid-first round pick at the corner position, one of the hardest positions to transition to into the NFL, to fill his shoes right away. So they certainly took a step back in certain areas. Now, they did what they could with the limited cap space they had. Obviously, I talked about, franchising Dak, keeping Cooper. In terms of new additions, The first guy we're going to talk about is Gerald McCoy. Gerald McCoy, yeah, he's up there in age. I think he's going to be 32 or 33 next year. Obviously for a long time with the Tampa Bay Bucks was known as one of the best DTs in the league. I think he went to 5 straight Pro Bowls from like 12 to 17, something like that. The last 2 years, he's still been relatively strong. I think he had 5 sacks last year from the interior position. I think it was a 3-year deal for about $18 million a season. So it was a cost-effective deal. It's a veteran, and I think he's a guy that will certainly help them. Will he replace the significance of Robert Quinn? Maybe not. But for the money they spent and to get a player like that, I think the Cowboys did a pretty good job. And it's not really going that much against the cap. The other guy we'll talk about was another short-term deal, and that is Clinton Dix. And they got Dix for only a $4 million contract on a 1-year deal. Clinton Dix still graded in the mid-70s per PFF. He's still known to be a pretty solid safety, and now he's been reunited with his initial head coach, with Mike McCarthy, of course, when he started with the Green Bay Packers. So some pretty good signings overall for the Dallas Cowboys, if you ask me. I still don't think it obviously matches what they lost, and we'll get into their future cap space, based on some of the decisions that they did make. Next team we're going to talk about is the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles and the Cowboys, obviously going into next year, are more than likely going to be the favorites. The Giants and Redskins certainly probably improved their teams, but they're not there yet. At least that will be the consensus by, what most people think. The Eagles lost a lot of depth in this free agency period. I wouldn't say that they lost huge impact players, but they certainly lost some depth and some veterans on their roster. Nigel Bradham remains unsigned. Timmy Jernigan remains unsigned, but both of them are expected to be losses for the Philadelphia Eagles. In addition to that, they lost Vaitai. Vaitai's kind of been a depth piece on their offensive line, a former early round pick for the Eagles. I think he's been with them now for 4 years. He signed a 5-year, $45 million contract to finally get a chance to start with the Detroit Lions. So not a guy that really hurt their starting lineup, but definitely was a nice piece for them in terms of a depth offensive lineman. In addition to that, they lost the veteran offensive tackle Jason Peters. Peters, of course, 38 years old. And with him moving on, they will now move Andre Dillard into the starting position for the foreseeable future. Of course, Dillard was an early draft pick for them last year, a guy that was ranked very highly coming into the draft. So if Dillard fills in admirably, it won't be much of a loss. But obviously, Peters, what was a long-term Eagle and a great leader on that football team. So definitely, something that they could be losing there in terms of the leadership department. Another veteran that they lost, who was a big part of their team, was Malcolm Jenkins. Jenkins went on to sign a 4-year, $32 million deal with the Saints. The free safety was a solid player for them, but because of their cap situation, they had to have some guys full off the roster, and that's what they elected to do. In addition to that, they also lost Jordan Howard, who he did sustain an injury last year for the Eagles, but in my opinion was one of the better running backs on the free agency market. He signed a 2-year deal, close to $5 million per season, with the Miami Dolphins, and was a nice compliment to Sanders. Obviously, Sanders, I expect to get an expanded role, the first-round running back for the Eagles last year. Are these losses going to kill the Eagles this year? No, I still think the Eagles will be a very competitive team and are probably the favorites in the NFC when you factor in some of the losses for the Cowboys. But we'll have to wait and see with the coaching change with McCarthy. That could certainly change things. They lost they added Darius Slay, which was a really nice pickup for them. And I think it was only a 3-year deal, if I'm not mistaken. They did give up a 3rd and a 5th round pick to acquire him. So that hurts their future, much like their cap situation. They definitely lost some draft picks here, but they brought in a guy who's, still in the middle of his prime, who's still one of the top 10 corners or so in the NFL. And it was a need for the Eagles. A lot of people pointed to the fact that maybe the Eagles could draft a corner in the first round. Now they could definitely focus on the wide receiver position, which is also a major need for this football team. And obviously, Darius Slay is a very good pickup. And then in addition to that, they also brought in a strong defensive tackle in Hargrave, formerly of the Pittsburgh Steelers, on a 3-year, $39 million contract. And they'll pair him with Fletcher Cox, up at the middle of that defensive line, and they'll have a very strong defensive front. So the Eagles definitely made some moves, in my opinion, that may have even helped their team this year. They lost some depth, but their future looks bleak, and we'll get into that after we go over what the Redskins did in terms of key additions and key losses. The Washington Redskins are in a very similar situation to that of the New York Giants. They're picking early in the draft like they have been the last couple of years. They have a young quarterback. We'll see if they stick with Haskins. We'll see if they don't. But I really do like the way that they attacked free agency. They had a very similar approach to that of the New York Giants. I think that they saw their situation. They said we want to keep as much cap space as we can, and their cap space is in phenomenal shape, even better than the Giants. They have a ton of cap space. But in terms of their signings, they signed a bunch of short-term deals outside of Kendall Fuller, and we'll get into all of them in a second. Their losses, well, we'll get into that as well, and we'll start there. Josh Norman, of course, was a loss if you want to call it that. Norman, of course, is more of a name than a talent at this point in time, was a great cornerback for the Panthers. Get him and let him walk. The Redskins signed him to a contract that they later regretted and seemingly have learned from their mistakes as they didn't break the bank on any free agents this year. Also, notable free agents that they lost was the former New York Giant Eric Flowers, who actually played pretty well for them at the guard, signed a 3-year, $30 million deal with the Dolphins, was not a good New York Giant, and they lost backup quarterback Case Keenum, but nothing crazy there in terms of the losses. In terms of the gains, the biggest gain for them, like I said, they didn't bring in any big name guys. They signed Brandon Scherf on the franchise tag. I think he'll probably remain with the Redskins when you see how much cap space they have. I could be wrong, but I would think that they would keep him. It was about a $14 million deal for the guard, so they keep him on. In addition to that, they also bring in their most notable free agent acquisition, the former Redskin, Kendall Fuller. Fuller was traded to the Kansas City Chiefs, and now he's come back. He won a Super Bowl last year. He signed a 4-year, $40 million deal to play the slot corner, and you can at least make an argument that he was the best slot corner on the open market. So this was a really nice add for the Redskins. It wasn't a deal that kills their cap. Only $10 million a season for a very strong slot corner. And some other notable players that they brought in were J.D. McKissick, the running back from the Seattle Seahawks, Thomas Davis. So they made nice cost-effective moves to set themselves up for the future and to try to make them a more competitive roster going forward. Had a very similar approach to that of the New York Giants. In terms of the division as a whole and their future with cap space and everything else, we're going to start with the Washington Redskins, and we're going to look at their 2021 cap space and some potential cuts, and then we'll get into the exact dollar amount in terms of how much cap space they have. Now, this isn't fully updated because I don't see Fuller on here, so you got to factor that in. I don't know how much he's going to be making in his second year. Some of the signings didn't come on all the way, so maybe they'll have, maybe 10, 15 less $1 million, but regardless, their cap situation is very good. When you look at the top, Alex Smith is almost certainly going to be cut. They can't cut him this year because he carries like a $30 million hit. Next year, it would be a $10 million hit. So that would kind of offset the contract that, Kendall Fuller is probably going to have when they update this. Probably even a little more savings. So it kind of offsets that. So when I show you their cap space, what they have, it's probably going to be pretty accurate. In terms of the other players, I mean, you look at their highest paid players, most of them are still on their rookie deals. Guys like Haskins, Montez Sweat, Darius Geis. Landon Collins is obviously going to stay there. They just signed him. So I don't think they make any other cuts, maybe one or two others, but they have more than enough cap space to keep everybody on their rosters. They've set this up very nicely after free agency. This is an estimate, but as of right now, they have about $130 million in cap space, by far the most in the division. I think the Giants right now, after all the contracts came in and all the front loading, it wasn't fully up to the last time I did the video. I think it was at about 83. I think now it's at about 75. But they're still going to have close to 100 because you're going to cut Solder for 14. That bumps you up to 89. And then there's a couple other moves that they could potentially make. But it's nowhere near what the Redskins have. The Redskins have a lot of money going forward. And they're going to be able to do, a lot of good things for this football team. So we'll have to wait and see exactly what they could do. But the Redskins have a very bright future in terms of cap space and roster construction. Of course, the quarterback is still a major question. The other team we're going to talk about is the Dallas Cowboys and what they did with their roster. Dallas Cowboys, obviously they kept on Amari Cooper. This is their roster going forward. I don't see them making any major cuts. All these guys are signed for, pretty lengthy contracts, and they all carry a pretty substantial dead cap hit outside of Tyron Smith, but I don't see them cutting him. He's imperative for that offensive line, being the blindside protector. So this is their roster going forward. And what the Cowboys have basically done is they've retained their draft picks. So that's why they don't have a ton of cap space going forward, but they could still make certain moves. When you look at the cap space next year, they still have about $68 million. Of course, like I said, this is an estimate. That is without Dak Prescott on the roster because Dak Prescott right now is franchise tag. So factoring in that they're probably going to spend $35 to $40 million on Dak, that number is going to be substantially lower. You're probably looking at about $25 to $30 million that they'll be able to spend in free agency next year after the acquisition of Dak, and then, draft and everything else definitely comes into play. So they don't have the best of cap situations, but they've retained their players from the draft, so they're looking decent. They have a young team because they've drafted so well. And then finally, we're going to look at the Philadelphia Eagles. And in 2021, Wentz's cap hit really goes up. He didn't go much against the cap last year. I think this is his first year that he will, and then it even gets worse going forward. He'll be making $34 million next year, so that's certainly going to hurt their cap. Fletcher Cox, you look at that, you're not cutting him. It's a $15 million dead cap hit. Jeffrey, they could maybe get creative. I see here it's a 10.5. I've heard different things that maybe if they cut him at a certain date, they save a little more money. But if they were to cut Jeffrey, which most people suspect they will, they'd save about $8 million there. But pretty much everybody else they're not cutting. Brandon Graham, way too big of a hit. Lane Johnson, Jason Hargrave, Brandon Brooks, Malik Jackson. We'll see if they could trade Zach Ertz. I've heard Eagle fans talk about that. Deshaun Jackson's still a substantial hit, but if they were to cut him, you could save about $5 million there. So if you were to cut D. Jackson, Jeffrey, you got to fill in for 2 wide receivers, one of which will probably be in this draft, but it would free up about, $12 million or so in cap of what they're projected to have, which is not much right now, which is at $20 million, which with the increased salary cap would pretty much just pay for your draft and give you a little extra money on the side. But the Eagles are a win-now team. They'll try to compete this year, and it'll be interesting to see, being that they backloaded all these contracts, how they're going to keep that team afloat. But going into the season next year, I would actually say that the Eagles are probably the favorites, with the Cowboys being second, Giants being third, Redskins being fourth. But things could change after the draft, and obviously anything could happen on any given Sunday. But yeah, I just want to give you guys a roundabout of the key acquisitions for both teams, all 4 teams rather, the departures, and how they're looking for the future. In terms of cap space, the Redskins and Giants will have a lot more room to try to improve this team, as they should, being that their teams are not as good. They haven't retained draft picks, and they did not go hog wild in free agency. As always, guys, if you liked what you watched, please subscribe, drop a comment, maybe give me a little thumbs up. Cheers.